In these videos, we are going to be talking about several different persuasive strategies that one can use in a persuasive message, and how those persuasive strategies can go awry and cause fallacies. So first, we're going to talk about the persuasive strategies that one can use in a persuasive message. As we've discussed previously, the study of persuasion and the study of communication has been around for centuries, and it was actually Aristotle who coined the persuasive strategies, also known as the rhetorical proofs. And you may have heard of these rhetorical proofs before in the way of ethos, pathos, and logos. So first, let's talk about ethos. Ethos is the credibility of a speaker. So when we're talking about ethos, we're just talking about whether or not we think that we can trust the speaker that is sending us a message. And there's three main components to ethos that help build the ethos of an individual. First is competence, then trustworthiness, and finally dynamism and goodwill. So first with competence. When we're looking to the competence of a speaker, we as an audience member are trying to figure out whether or not the speaker knows what they are talking about. If we feel like the speaker has a good knowledge base about their subject matter, then we feel like they are a credible speaker. Second is trustworthiness. When we're looking to the trustworthiness of a speaker, we are trying to assess whether or not we feel like we can trust the speaker. Or, in other words, we're trying to figure out whether we believe the speaker is always going to be telling us the truth, or if they are going to be feeding us lies in order to try and get us to do whatever it is they want us to do. So, in addition to looking at the competence and trustworthiness of a speaker, we also look to the dynamism and goodwill of the speaker. When we're looking at this element, we are trying to determine whether or not the speaker has our best interest at heart. We're basically looking at the amount that the speaker cares about us as an audience. That's the goodwill that the speaker has towards us. When we're looking at dynamism, we're looking at the energy that the speaker has. We are looking at their charisma. And typically, if a speaker has really high charisma and seems like they have goodwill towards us, then we're more likely to see them as a credible speaker. Credibility happens in three stages: initial credibility, derived credibility, and terminal credibility. So first, let's talk about initial credibility. The initial credibility of a speaker is the credibility that the speaker has before he or she even starts to speak. And we're going to explore the process of credibility development through one example. So let's say, for example, that your school has welcomed two very special guest speakers to campus to talk about the effects that climate change is going to have on our world. And those two guest speakers are Bill Nye, the science guy, and Taylor Swift. Now, when you see this announcement, you initially think to yourself, okay, I could understand why Bill Nye is on a panel about climate change. You know, he is the science guy after all. He taught us science when we were all kids. Whereas you saw the name Taylor Swift on the docket and thought to yourself, why is she there? So to begin with, the initial credibility of these two speakers is very different. The initial credibility of Bill Nye is fairly high because he has credibility that comes along with his name. When we're talking about science things, like climate change, for example, we think of Bill Nye as a relatively credible individual. Whereas when it comes to Taylor Swift, she may have credibility in the realm of music, for example, but on a panel about climate change, you're just not sure that she quite fits. So her initial credibility is going to be relatively low. Now, let's say that you go to this talk. You decide, hey, I get to see Bill Nye, the science guy, and Taylor Swift live. Like, that's pretty cool. And so you're watching these two individuals speak about climate change, and as they're talking, some of the things that Bill Nye is saying don't quite sit right with you. In fact, some of the facts, quote unquote, that he is purporting go directly against some of the knowledge that you already have about climate change. Meanwhile, Taylor Swift seems really well versed in the topic of climate change. She seems like she knows what she's talking about. And so, while the two speakers are talking, your perception of their credibility is shifting. We call this the derived credibility. The derived credibility is the credibility that a speaker gains or loses during their speech. So derived is during. Terminal credibility is the credibility that you believe the speaker to have after the speech has completed. So this is at the end of the speech. So after you leave the talk, you tell your friend afterward, you're like, oh, I went to this really cool climate change panel and it had Bill Nye and Taylor Swift on it. And I thought Bill Nye was going to be really intelligent, but some of the things he said just were kind of off. Meanwhile, Taylor Swift surprised me, and she was actually really credible when it comes to climate change. So the terminal credibility is the thought that you have about the person's credibility after the speech is given. So Bill Nye's has lowered quite a bit from the initial credibility that you had, whereas Taylor Swift's has increased. Now, the important thing to remember about credibility is that credibility does not exist within the body of the speaker. We are not inherently credible individuals. Our credibility as a speaker rests solely within the minds of the audience. They are the only ones who can determine whether or not we are credible on whatever given topic. The next persuasive strategy that we're going to talk about is pathos. And pathos are emotional appeals that we use to try and change someone's mind. When we are using pathos, our main goal is to stir the audience's emotions and get them involved in the speech, to really get them caring about the speech. We're trying to make them feel happy or sad or guilty or scared, any one of those kinds of emotions, in order to get them to act on that emotion. And generally speaking, when a persuasive speaker is using a pathos appeal, they're going to try to appeal to a really negative emotion. The reason for this is we don't like to deal with negative emotions. We want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. And so a persuasive speaker might try to instill that negative emotion in you as an audience member and then offer you a solution to get rid of that negative emotion. Think about those infamous ASPCA commercials that you might have seen on television. You know the ones. They have the sad animals in the background, a small dog cowering in the corner of a cage, while Sarah McLachlan sings a really sad song over it. And every time that you see these commercials, you just think, oh, those poor puppies. That commercial is playing with your emotions. They are using pathos appeals. And they give you an opportunity to get rid of that sadness and that guilt by donating $19 a month to help these poor, sad animals. And so if you are trying to use pathos appeals, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to stir those emotions to cause your audience to take some kind of action. Now, pathos appeals can be the most easily manipulated of all of these appeals, or rather they can be seen as the most manipulative. And so we do have to be careful when using pathos appeals and make sure that we combine it with ethos and or logos appeals as well. So finally, let's talk about logos. And we're going to be talking about logos pretty much for the duration of this lecture today. But when we're talking about logos, we are looking at the reasoning or logic behind an argument. We are trying to argue basically that something makes sense. We are presenting credible information and or evidence to the audience and trying to get them to buy into our story that way. So we might provide them with examples or statistics or testimony and verbally cite our sources within the speech in order to get our audience on our side. Now, in addition to evidence-based arguments. Logos also just simply uses logic-based arguments. And we're going to be talking about logical reasoning in the next several videos. But suffice it to say that ethos, pathos, and logos are three very powerful persuasive strategies that you can use in your persuasive speeches in order to try and get your audience to take the action that you want them to take.